Hi, I'm Brian Dunn, and welcome to the most important podcast ever. Very excited about our episode this week. Dr. Guy Beaudin is back and has agreed very generously to do a 3-episode arc with us this season. And I return being very generous. I'm calling it the Beaudin Dialogue, because it's named after him, but it is my initials, CBD, so it works. This podcast, as you know, is about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, the moments of resilience, the lessons learned, and the small acts that made a big difference. From retail floors to boardrooms, we'll share the untold stories that shape lives and careers. Our first episode with Guy this year, and I sincerely am thrilled to have him back, is this idea of, I call it the cave of self, and it's my language for identity, ego, and a thing I think Guy introduced me to, and that is this idea of quiet drift of leaders. Or maybe everything smart that I don't readily understand, I attribute to Guy. One way or another. So hello, Guy, how are you?
I'm really, really thrilled to be here again. And, Smartless still hasn't called me, so I'm going to keep on doing this until, I become the Sean Hayes of Canada. So until that happens, we got a team going.
And I bet if that happens, you won't be doing 3-episode arcs with me, so I've got to make hay while the sun shines.
All the time. I mean, I love these topics, and I think I love the way you've frame this. And I think what we want to do in this series is really kind of think about leadership, but in very practical ways that, kind of help people to think about kind of their own journey. And I really want to leave people with some sense of what do we do with these ideas. And I agree with you that, and one of the there's a lot of interesting things that we can cover in this topic of, the cave of the self and, the drift. But I think if the theme for me around this one is, how do you keep the aperture open in your leadership as long as possible? Where I find, where leaders tend to drift is when they get cut off, from what's really happening on their team, from what's really happening in the markets, from the conflicts or situations that are happening in the organization that nobody wants to talk to them about. And I think it starts with this collapse into self where you kind of shut people off. So let's start with this idea of quiet drift. And I think, we've talked about this before, and we tend to look for, the car crash, but it's usually more like the slow leak. I'm going to have so many metaphors tonight with the cave. Like it's going to be.
Let's mix them up. let's mix all the metaphors we can, Guy.
It's going to be crazy. So I was thinking about this, like how do we, help ourselves as leaders think about when does that quiet drift start? And I've got sort of 2 ideas where I think the quiet drift starts. One is when you start to move from curiosity to judgment, like when you're grounded in leadership, when you're out of the cave and you're in the sunshine, you're curious. You think about, why did this happen? What could we learn from this? We really kind of in a spirit of curiosity. And when you move to judgment, you start to say, well, why did this happen? Start to lay blame. And I think that's really the start from where people then you start to cut people off. They stop telling you what's really happening because they see you move into judgment. So the first one is moving from curiosity to judgment. And the second thing for me is like the busyness disguise, right? Because, if you stay busy, you kind of cut yourself off from needing to engage in the right conversations with your team that would allow you to really see and understand what's going on with them. So I'm curious to see sort of, Brian, you brought up this topic, so there might be a reason for you that was significant for you. Is there something in these concepts that I put in here that sort of resonate with you?
Yeah, there really is, Guy. And I find even in my personal life, I will do this. I The difference between time for quiet reflection, which is very important to me in how I think and how I process things, can easily drift, word of the day, I guess,
Yeah.
into the aperture, to build on your metaphor, closing.
Yeah.
And I think it can be so subtle. And when I look back on things that didn't go well or as well as I had hoped or planned for them to, I think a lot of it I can tie to that aperture. Look, I'm doing a visual representation, that aperture closing. And it's so seductive to be alone with your thoughts. And I'm doing quiet reflection and thinking through it. And some of that's good, and too much is bad.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Because there's a certainty, right? If you're only you and your thoughts, you don't get to confront your ideas. And so why does that happen? Why do we get in that space? And I think a lot of leaders get into that space. And I think it's something that you've mentioned here a couple of times, which is the identity fusion. Like when I start to
Mm,
be my role, when who I am is what I do, then you put on that armor because you need to protect yourself, because then every business critique or everything that goes wrong on the balance sheet becomes a kind of a personal attack, and that's really hard even on a very healthy ego. Once that fusion happens, you need to put on that armor because it's way too stressful to deal with. And then that's when you start to lose also your connection, you lose your humanity, and you start to lose your connection to the team. And I say this thing a lot, and I maybe it's too simplistic, Brian, but what I find where teams start to drift is when we forget we're just people trying to do shit together, right?
mm.
And when we start to become the role, and there's a whole the ceremony of the where we meet and how we meet and the agenda and all this stuff, all these distancing mechanisms that you really have to fight against. And I think one of the big reasons we do that, and I think, is this fusion trap, right? Because as I said, when you kind of sort of become what you do, and why it's so hard to know that it's happening, because what happens is in the negative. What's that Sherlock Holmes thing? The dog that didn't bark. I don't know. I'm not going to mess that one up. But anyway, but the thing is, someone could Google that.
all, all, all I have for you is Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yes, that's it. That's it.
You're welcome.
Because it's the things that stop happening. The people stop disagreeing with you. Because if every time they disagree with you, it's such a personal attack that causes you to be defensive, they learn. They put on their armor, right? Which is to, we can't disagree with Brian because bad things is going to happen to us. So they get into self-preservation mode. So all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of people on a team who are in self-preservation mode. And I see that in the teams that I coach. They're having conversations with me about challenges they're having with one another, but
Right.
they're not having that conversation with one another because they don't feel safe to have that conversation. And the challenge there, as I said, is because you don't know that it's happening, because it's things that people are not telling you, and that's really hard to understand, hard to perceive. Yeah.
Two thoughts, and I really am tracking with you. One, it's so hard to not take it personally, because taking it personally and accepting personal responsibility is kind of what's propelled you into this role and into
Yeah.
this space. And the
Yeah.
fact that you're willing to stand up and say, yes, I'm responsible. I may hold others accountable, but ultimately I'm responsible because the buck stops with me.
Yeah.
Um, so let's put that off to the side for a second, because I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. I have found, and from what I've read, I don't think I'm unique. The hardest thing there is to do is have, at a high level, a senior team identify as a team and actually care about the others, because
Mm.
even in that space, people are competing because that's sort of what's been rewarded.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's very, very true. And actually, I'm starting to work with a team now. Well, there's two teams in the same organization, and so interesting, right? It's like we could write a
Yeah.
thesis on this, but one team, it's very much that attitude. People are competing for resources. They've got a new leader. They're competing for, the leader's favor. They're concerned that the leader's going to make changes on the team, so they really retreat in that self-preservation mode. And so what you see is we go to the meeting, we kind of agree, but then we go off and do our own thing because we want to get the resources, we want to get the accolades, and we get the rewards that come from that. In a same organization, different team, and the trust is super high. Like the leader has instilled in them that all the decisions that we are going to make are for the good of the enterprise, not for the good of any one of you. And so the turning point for that team is he fired one person who was not behaving according to those principles. And that is really the litmus test, right? So you can say these things, and then if someone is not behaving that way, if someone is like, hogging the blanket, we should have a metaphor on this. Right? If someone is hogging the blanket and you don't throw them out of bed, then you lose all credibility.
Absolutely. And let's put humanity on that. That's hard to do, to fire somebody that is not playing well on that horizontal team, particularly if their vertical is running well and producing.
Yeah.
And yet we know that horizontal senior team is ultimately, I think, the most important, certainly a leading indicator for what kind of success the organization's going to have. Because those are, as you described much earlier to me, there are fatal behaviors.
Yeah.
Competing with your arch rival is actually a fatal behavior. And yet it's table stakes to get you into that game.
And I think 100% with that. And I think if I think about where do we should probably do one of these on Teams, just on Teams, actually. Think about it because it's kind of
that's a great idea. Let's do that.
An interesting topic. When you know that the team is functioning, they become self-regulating. And this is happening on this team. So one of the guys got let go. And I think, that was a big turning point. But there's another individual in the team who sometimes has these behaviors. And then they call him up. The leader doesn't have to do it anymore. And it's become so acceptable that it's almost humorous. It's kind of like, there you go, Frank, you're doing it again, right? And because it's become acceptable and not, accusatory, to kind of maintain that kind of culture, because it's so important on the team. So I agree with you. I think it's a kind of a key component of how you maintain the health of the team. And I think something that leads into, for me, is kind of the paradox of success, right? That leaders easily fall into, and that leads to other blind spots. Because essentially, what we're trying to talk about here is what can lead to the blind spot that cut us off from what we need to know to be a good leader. And in a weird way, like success is one of them. So this is what I often see with new leaders. Like if they're new in their role, if they're smart, they're kind of freaked out, right? They kind of go, holy shit. I mean, to your point, I raise my hand. You have to be comfortable with accountability. As a leader, if you're going to raise your hand to lead, you have to be comfortable with accountability, but you should also be a little bit freaked out when you get it, because now the responsibility is on your shoulders. So a leader, when they start, usually, if they're smart enough, they're kind of like a little freaked out. So they ask a lot of questions, they consult a lot of opinions, they seek advice, they question their own judgment, but they bring their judgment to the table. And with all that together, you make the best calls that you can make, knowing all of that context. If you're smart, you lead that way throughout your entire tenure, because pulling all those data points internally, externally, combined with your judgment, will lead you to the best answers. And many do, honestly, many do. But at some point, some start to see, oh, well, I'm not sure that this member of the team is good to make that call. So I'm going to make that call for myself. And maybe that call works. And then you start to make more calls. And, the dopamine hit of being right continues to increase. And you start to see your team in a more negative light as you start to see your own impact on the organization more and more positively. So I see that, it creates a blind spot. It's interesting here in politics in Canada. The only political comment I'm going to make, but we don't have term limits, but yet most leaders only last 8 to 10 years anyway. And why is that? Because I think it's because of this paradox of success. They start to make calls, they start to believe their own press, and then this kind of ego takes over and it convinces us that we don't need to listen to other people anymore. And in a complex world, I would say, I don't know is often the right answer, but hard for leaders to say.
And they haven't gotten into that big game. They've gotten into that big game because they've had answers completely arbitrary 71.5% of the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's a comfort when things get difficult in taking more and more of that decision making on in here where there's less noise, less distraction, you think, but it's so easy. All that armor you're wearing absolutely clouds the quality of the data that's coming in.
Yeah. And oftentimes, and I think you had that, as I throughout all your career, you've always had that one person who would kind of tell you, you're in the cave, Brian. You're not listening, or people are trying to land you a message, and someone that you trusted along the way, and who would sort of be there enough to kind of know when that was happening for you. And that's invaluable. I provided that, and you did listen to those people along the way, but that's another kind of key success factor in my mind.
And don't you think, I think I absolutely agree with you. And shout out to all those truth tellers that were with me. You know who you are. I think that you need to seek those people out. People that are utterly unimpressed and just want to work the problem. And I think go ahead.
No, I think that's exactly right. In the the metaphor I use is when it's no longer a joint problem to solve, you kind of know you're in your cave, right?
Yeah.
If it's no longer a problem that we solve together, you kind of know you're in your cave. There's a side trip here that I'd like to take with you because I don't really hear people talk about this, and it's money and how that plays into the blind spots. And I see it operate in two ways. One is some people start to believe their paycheck. You know what I mean? Like, you gain, perks and money and all the things that are, justifiably so. Leaders are making, they're tough jobs, they're making tough calls. But it's part of that, sort of ego collapse, right? If I not only become my job, but if I become my paycheck, then I start to believe I'm suddenly smarter just because, I'm being paid more money, which is obviously not necessarily the case.
Guy, it's almost never the case that you're smarter by virtue of a title. The night before I became CEO, I walked up and down through the commons area of the office, waiting for the angel of wisdom to come upon me. No one's home, baby.
I know. I kind of had that same, the day I finally defended my dissertation, I didn't feel, all of a sudden sort of wiser the next day. You just got through and I think that sort of how that, comp issue plays out is for the people on your team, right? Because they're preserving their own, livelihood as well. And so the risk of them being truth tellers, becomes quite considerable. So I was having this conversation with a CEO that I'm coaching, and he was talking about the challenge. He's in a really very tough situation. The market he's in is really, really difficult. And I said, no, these CEOs, they're really roles of service. He says, well, yes, but the monthly odometer on my financial obligations runs higher and higher. So service, yes, but I need this job. So
Yeah.
it sort of plays out in, it kind of biases the issue. It gets harder to stick to the truth and to make it a joint problem to solve, because it does kind of bias things, I think.
It's part of the trap, isn't it? It's part of the, if not trap, it's certainly a treat inside the cave.
It's,
It's
so the cave. Yeah. And it's all these things, right? They're kind of markers of when you're kind of in the cave, and things that you can look out for that might be triggers to kind of go into the cave. I think there's some interesting ones here.
I think it's very interesting, and I have been thinking about that horizontal line in the behaviors that we sort of were touching on, where that team really has to be focused on what's good for the enterprise, as opposed to their vertical. And that is rarefied air. And I don't think you can certainly find people with those characteristics, but I think as the leader, it's your most important job.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well put and well said. But it's hard to know. I mean, I assess leaders for a living, right? And some of these intangibles are really hard to discern, but I think they have to be on your, 3 to 4 things you're looking for when you're looking for someone to come on your team. That's got to be one that kind of plays well in the sandbox. When one of my clients here, private equity clients, that's the number one thing they want to understand. What is this person's motivation? Are they motivated to grow the pie, or are they motivated to get a bigger piece of the pie?
Right. And
Metaphor number 2.
What have you found? What do you think about that?
I don't know what the percentages are, Brian, but in the early parts of your career, you get rewarded for getting a bigger piece of the pie. You get rewarded for having the right answer. You get rewarded for, leading the project. You get rewarded for having the bright idea in the meeting when the leader suddenly recognizes you. So all those things.
You get rewarded for having the best performing district or region or whatever it is. You don't get rewarded for calling me up and saying, hey, Brian, if you try this, this, and this, I think you're going to find a better outcome.
Well, it's interesting because I remember being in some of the teams that you led where, sharing best practices was a core part of the agenda. Yeah. And I wasn't smart enough about your business to know if people were really being sort of honest or were they saving that one card in their back pocket? I don't know. But I know that's something that you tried to instill, but you're right, you have to constantly fight against that.
I'll just give you a micro example of that. So I had a district in the Twin Cities, and Mark had the other district in the Twin Cities, and we were butting heads and looking to outperform the other, always. And then one night over a dinner and a glass of wine, we just started talking about what we were each good at, what we were each doing in those areas, and we combined those things and we shared them. And both our businesses that we were responsible for just took off to the point where senior executives, we started to get on their radar screen.
Yeah. That's a great
story. It just stayed with me. And I certainly, you know what I really struggle with? Let's talk about me for a minute, because we haven't talked that much about me, Guy. I think I really struggled with, you started off talking about the leader on one of the teams you're working with moved on somebody who was doing a nice job in their vertical, but not working well in the horizontal. I struggled with that because I had leaders, I worked with people that were great in their verticals and not great here. And if I tolerate that, then it becomes the de facto operating norm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
hard to do.
And people, and it's hard to maintain one's credibility as a leader because you're talking about these principles, but people see you operating in a different way. I love that story of you and Mark. I think it's so powerful, and then the right leader will notice that, right? I mean, if you got a leader who's just rewarding you for your vertical, then it's tough to get noticed. So clearly, you had leaders who kind of noticed those things. It's interesting with one of my colleagues when I started almost 30 years ago. We were very competitive with one another, and we were in the airport having a drink, and I just said, wow, we're so competitive. Like every month, we kind of look at our numbers, and it was eye-opening for him because it was really hard for him. He found it very difficult, and we made a situation discussable. Then we started to collaborate on clients, and it created a positive outcome, exactly as you described. You can rarely lose by trying to help other people be better at what they do. You can rarely lose by doing that.
And I think I believe you said making something discussable. I think that's a skill like anything else. If you want your arms stronger, you're doing curls in the gym. Practicing with live ammo and discussing things that you're uncomfortable discussing is okay. Not only is it okay, it can lead to a really a robustly positive outcome.
Can I talk about one last thing about where I think kind of leads you into the cave, can lead you into the cave?
Please.
It's the personal, professional intersection, right? And again, if you go to my idea that we tend to forget that we're just people trying to get shit done, we think that we can, kind of be one person at home, then sort of put on that armor and go into battle at work, but that's not true. Whatever you're experiencing in your personal life, whatever challenges, stressors you have, and they're going to happen. I mean, people are leaders between the ages of 30 and 60 by and large, where you're getting married, you're growing your family, you're raising your kids, you're paying off your mortgage, your kids leave, you become empty nesters. I mean, there's all these stressors you're going to have in your life over the period of your life as a leader. And I really want to normalize the discussion that personal stress will bleed and will create some of that professional drift. And this myth of compartmentalization is not true. So I really encourage people to think about, what am I worried about at work? And what am I worried about at home? And how is what I'm worrying about at home, how is it bleeding into what's happening to me at work? And if I want to leave maybe one actionable tool from this conversation, is to do that as a course of hygiene, like as part of your Sunday prep. Like, where am I now? What am I worried about this week at home and at work? And am I really worried about this at work, or is my personal life bleeding in? Don't wait until it becomes a crisis. That's where the drift can start. Mm-hmm. Really kind of question yourself and become aware of where that can happen. So that's one practice that to be helpful.
I think that's really good. And I'll just toss this last log on the fire. I read an article this afternoon by Kelly McGinnis, somebody new that I've discovered that I think is very interesting. And the essay was about, there's one paradigm. It's you. And this notion of compartmentalizing is, you can tell yourself that all you want, but it's one you. So you need to, the more you can think like that, the more you can understand the role each component, each facet in your life plays on.
And maybe what we get to in this conversation, Brian, is maybe a simple thing that starts with kind of having some compassion for yourself, knowing that leadership is hard, and conducting these lives have their challenges as well. And maybe my final thought on this is that, you can't hate yourself into becoming a better leader. You can't beat yourself up. You know, if you feel yourself drifting, if you feel your team is not telling you, the hard stuff, if you feel like that identity, between you and your job, getting sort of stronger and kind of causing you some stress, like don't beat yourself up, but ask yourself why. Ask why is the armor there? And I really think, the best leaders, are not the ones who never drift. They're the ones who ask themselves the question, why am I drifting? And what can I do, to get out of the cave?
I also just want to add, I think if you think you're drifting or asking, am I drifting? You are drifting. you know the answer. Listen, Guy, by way of wrapping up here, I want to thank you so much. Our time always flies by. Um, do you know that I get more questions for you in my DMs than any other episodes?
I had no idea. So we
So,
should bring them up. We should have a Q&A question.
well, see, I'm operating a horizontal here. That's exactly what I'm getting at. What a great idea, Guy. Please send us your questions because Guy and I likely in episode 3 this year will spend time on your questions and talking about what you want to talk about. Guy, I cannot thank you enough. I so enjoy this time with you and I learn. And to the audience, I'm sorry if it feels like you're sitting in on a therapy session that I'm having, but I find it so refreshing and I really appreciate you sharing your time. I know your schedule is very busy.
It's a real pleasure. By the way, Sean Hayes called during our episode, and I said no. I'm already busy.
So glad to hear that. I'm so glad to hear that. Well, that's it for this episode of the most important podcast ever. A big thanks to Dr. Guy Beaudin for sharing his story, but an even bigger thanks to you for tuning in and listening. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone that might find it helpful. You can watch and listen on our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. And with that, I want to thank you again, Guy, and we'll see you all next week.